Thanks to all of you who have helped get me here. We had a great dinner before this, and I really enjoyed the discussion. Congratulations to the Merit Scholars for your achievements here. It seems like a great community to be learning in. I was here a couple of hours before the event, so I got to see a bit of the campus. And of course, what a nice day to take a tour of this campus. Pretty unusual for a February. Anyway, it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. We had some great discussions during dinner, so let's continue that. This is a picture of my triplet 6-year-old boys. I put that up because just to, fix in our mind that, our tissues and bones really do, those nutrients do come from the soil. There they are eating bit of the backyard soil. I figured that was a more direct, cheaper route than actually buying food. But, the 17 or so nutrients that plants need to be productive are the same ones that we need to grow. And thinking about humans, it's not just a one-off thing that we need food once in a while, but we need food 2 or 3 times a day, every day, in order to be healthy. And so, like I tell my boys, we really are what we eat, and what we eat ultimately does come from the soil. Now, this is a soil profile. It's about 6 feet or so deep, and you'll see roots running down. This is a soil profile from a native grassland prairie from Kansas. It's nice and deep, and for those that aren't familiar with soil, we see a lot of darker colors indicating an enrichment of carbon and nitrogen and so on. These types of native plant communities built up the soil in many of the regions of the world where agriculture is the most important. We're really living off the enriched soils built up and maintained by the native plant communities. Now, as the title would imply, this talk is mostly about soil. But don't worry, I've learned my lesson. This is a picture of the last group of students for which I focused specifically on soil, and I don't want to see that again. So it's about soil, but I won't spend very much time actually talking about soil. But we do need to remember that the bones and tissue that we grow, the phosphorus, calcium, and so on, do come from that. So let's just briefly in this portion. So I'm going to briefly hit a couple of big picture items on general processes. Then I want to talk just briefly, hit some high-level issues regarding food security, the population as it is, and we expect it to be over the next 40 years, and some of the implications globally for that, including the impacts of climate change, dwindling natural resources, and so on. Now, that's kind of the building some of those higher level issues to keep in mind. As at the end, toward the end of my talk, I want to put a personal face on it by covering the conditions on a farm in Malawi that I visited and sort of did a little case study of how these big items that we're struggling with academically, politically, economically, play out and affect and are influenced by things actually going on, smallholder farms around the world. So just to start out, if we took my body and sort of dehydrated it fully, we'd find that about 95% or more, I think it's closer to 96, is composed of nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So you think, well, that's a lot of what I am, so that's the most important. But actually, because of where we get our nutrients and how we get those 4 atmospheric elements into our body, it's just as important, these elements that are in the soil that plants use to capture sunlight, take up water, and so on. In other words, even though, as with humans and plants, these soil-based elements make up a relatively small part, mass-wise, of who we are, they're very important in allowing plants to continue grabbing those 4 very important elements out of the atmosphere. And of course, the reason we want to do that is because we derive our nutrients almost entirely from photosynthesis. Whether we eat plants directly or whether a cow eats the plant and then we eat the cow, ultimately those nutrients almost entirely come from plants, mediated by processes going on in the soil and capturing in that. And that's essentially what agriculture is. Not everything that we grow on farms is food. We also grow fuel. We grow material for clothing and so on. But pretty much across the board, we're trying to capture photosynthesis through plant growth and then use it for humans. Now, as we all know, we've seen these curves of population growth. And what we're looking at there, something troubling, is that here we are right about here at 7 billion, but we still have a long ways to go before we top out. And if we look at some of the issues that we face right now, without even going up to 9 billion, just here at 7 billion, we have currently over 1 billion people urgently hungry. That means if they're missing an extra meal or so, they're on their way to starvation. That's more people hungry at that level than ever before in history. And at 7 billion, it means more than 1 out of every 7 people is in that condition. So we're at a very troubling time right now, and yet we need to double food production to meet the needs coming up over the next several decades. So we need a lot more food. We need to produce a lot more food. Agriculture needs to do a lot more. One of the big problems that we face, really it's the major challenge I think facing humanity, is that doing agriculture, farming, poses the greatest risk to the planet. So at the very time that we need to double agricultural production, it's the most damaging of any of our behaviors. It affects nutrient cycling. It affects the way rivers flow. We're diverting a lot of water to agriculture. It's the major cause of species loss around the world. So even though we need it more now than ever, it's also our biggest challenge environmentally. So we also have to face the issue that now we're wanting to divert, right at the same time that we're wanting to increase food production, we're now diverting more food crops to things like biofuels. So we have the competition for non-food uses. Climate change, everyone's heard the warnings about the impact of climate change on food production. Not just more severe droughts or more frequent droughts, but also more intensive rainfall. Very intense rainfall can wipe out a crop. So all that is challenging. Rising energy costs. This is a big factor because a lot of the increased productivity in agriculture over the past several decades has come from putting more fossil fuel energy into the agricultural sector and raising productivity. One thing in particular is the use of fossil fuels to fertilize our crops. So here's my boys, I figured, well, if we're basing it on fossil fuels, let's just give it to them directly. Actually, don't worry, that's actually syrup, it's not oil. But this is important. It's not just symbolic, because Vaclav Smil up at the University of Manitoba did the calculations, and some 40% of humanity, based on mass, exists because of this Haber-Bosch process. Who here is familiar with the Haber-Bosch process? Okay, this actually should be a question on a test, because that's the process by which humans use fossil fuel energy to synthesize nitrogen from the atmosphere. So nitrogen, it's very abundant in the atmosphere, but it's connected by a triple chemical bond, very difficult to break, very difficult for plants to access. So we use a lot of energy to break that bond at high temperatures and under a lot of pressure. And that's how we manufacture synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Well, we use that to boost crop yields, and that essentially accounts for about 40% of our human population now. We've gone over the point, essentially, to where we can rely strictly on legumes, those plants like beans that are able to actually access atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to crops. We're hooked, as this picture would indicate, we're hooked on oil and fossil fuels. So, we have these converging factors that seem pretty ominous, and they've resulted in increased awareness across the board. And it culminated really a few years ago with dramatic increased prices in food. If you're spending half or 3/4 of your income on food already, and suddenly the price of food doubles, you're suddenly in a very, very scary place. You're not going to buy more food. You're essentially going to cut the amount that you're eating. So that sparked a lot of attention. National Geographic did a special on soils back in 2008, sort of looking at where food ultimately comes from. They also did a special on the global food crisis in 2009, sparked by the many food-caused riots around the world, including in Mexico, the Middle East, and so on. Food price spikes, people get very worried that they're not going to be able to feed their children. Even the academic journals, such as Science, picked up on this, had a whole issue devoted to addressing this issue of how in the world are we going to feed 9 billion people when right now we're struggling to feed 7 billion and with a dwindling resource base. Then Nature, the journal Nature, came out looking at the different ways technologically we could address this. There's the typical lab flask and looking to technological solutions. So how do we put this together, and what might it look like as we go forward? Now, let's just, looking at all those issues of where we are right now and go back out and look at what resources we have available. So if we took the atmosphere around the Earth and put it into a sphere, its relative size to the whole planet is that. Makes it look pretty small. Makes it look like we can impact that, and we have. Then we look at the liquid fresh water available for agriculture and other uses, and it's much smaller. We can see why water becomes such a central element when we talk about food production. And in many parts of the world, as much as 80% of the locally available fresh water is already diverted to agriculture. Now think about boosting yields to 2 times what they are, and you're already diverting 80% of the water to agriculture. Now, of course, what's missing here? We have air, we have water, soil. So that's how much soil relative to these other resources we have to do this. And that's based on 2 meters of soil depth, which frankly in many places we have a couple of feet available for food production. Now there's going to be a positive note to this talk. I'm just wanting to lay out the issues facing farmers around the world, facing the scientific community in looking for solutions. Because, we're pretty limited. I bunched these resources up because I think a lot of times we get the sense in this era of incredible innovation that there really aren't any limits. In fact, you walk into the Ronald Reagan building where I work every day, and there's a plaque on the wall that says, "There are no limits to human growth." But in fact, when we look at our natural resource base on which our whole economy, our whole global existence is based, there are limits. And we need to start defining those limits and looking at what innovations within those limits are possible. And so that's certainly what I want to address today. Now, just to go back to that growth curve, if we look at the last 40 to 50 years, look at the number of species, the amount of water that's been impacted, the amount of soil moved, the loss of soil from our landscapes. The last 40 to 50 years, we've experienced the greatest losses around the world. So when we think about the next 40 or 50 years, is it going to be similar? What are we going to do to get out of this? So now, okay, we're done with kind of the bad stuff. I think we can sort of breathe a sigh now and think about, start turning our attention to some of the possible answers. There's many out there. There's a lot of bright lights out there. I see them across the board in agriculture in particular. But I'm just going to quickly go through some concepts that I think build the foundation for some of the improvements and some of the solutions that are around the corner for us. This is a vegetation map. It's a little busy to read. But if we look around the world at what covered the landscapes prior to agriculture, pretty much all those different types of plant communities were dominated by perennial plants. So that's a tropical rainforest, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, lots of vines. Here's a shrub steppe from the Midwest of North America, lots of shrubs, perennial grasses, and so on. And then this is a tall grass prairie from Kansas, also nearly completely dominated by perennials. Of course, by perennials, I'm talking about plants that maintain either like trees, you know, that big above ground growth, leaves come back out in the spring, or in the case of grasses, they're maintaining a lot of living roots below the ground. They die off in the winter. Then in spring, they have this flush of regrowth. Those are the types of communities that really built up the soil. So let's just go below ground to look at some of their characteristics. This is a group of native grassland plants from Kansas that I excavated, cleaned the roots so we can see. You've got 4 or 5 different species. You've got some very fine roots from the grasses. You've got some of these, that nice deep taproot from a sunflower family member. So diversity of roots, and that's about 3 meters. It's very deep. So it's a lot of soil that those roots are getting into. And just, I want to emphasize that for a minute. It's hard to get a picture, I think. So this is Indian grass from Kansas that I excavated. And just to give you an idea of the kind of roots that these grasses have that built up our incredible agricultural soil. See if I can do this without falling down. But these are the kinds of root systems that built up our agricultural soils around the world. And it's no wonder that the United States is a powerhouse economically, industrially, because we inherited the richest agricultural soils in the world, built up by these perennial-based plant communities, be they forests more in the east or the grasslands of the west. And these plant roots aren't just sort of massive and impressive, but they operate at incredible scales. So just to give you a close-up, it's a bit unruly. So there's a close-up. See the scale down there? That's 1 millimeter. So these plant roots are acting like really sophisticated, elegant micromanagers on the scale of minutes and millimeters. If rain falls on a landscape, if nutrients are available, here you have this incredible safety net, feeding soil organisms below ground, capturing rainfall, taking up nutrients, and allowing the plants to be incredibly productive. And it's a general rule of thumb that when we look at landscape health across large landscapes, it's basically determined by very small-scale processes. Nitrogen, for example, is transformed from various types of nitrogen very rapidly in a matter of seconds and on very fine scales, less than a millimeter. So it's these plant roots, these plants, the primary source of energy for organisms below ground, these microorganisms that actually transform nutrients, make them available to plants. So we have very elegant regulators. It's the plumbing below ground that really allows these plant communities to be productive. Now, just very quickly, I want to take you through how that impacts a whole landscape. So we have a spring hillside in Kansas. The plants are regrowing from these deep root systems, so that's probably 2 to 3 meters deep. Certainly as deep as that Indian grass. The soil surface is nicely protected. The leaves from the previous year have fallen. They're protecting the soil surface. The root systems are pumping sugars, plant sugars below ground, feeding microorganisms. Very healthy, very vibrant biological community below ground. And of course, those very deep roots are tapping into water, tapping into phosphorus, and so on. Now, when it rains, you want the rain to soak into the soil. You don't want it to run off, because when it runs off, it can carry soil and nutrients with it. You want it to soak in, and then you want those plants to take it up. And by taking it up, they're taking up nutrients. That's how they're very productive, these native plant communities. This is how wildlife get their habitat and food sources from native plant communities. There's all that energy being captured by the sun, transformed into plant sugars, animals eat it. And most importantly, maybe, is that these plant communities are functioning over a long period of time, capturing sunlight. So that's how photosynthesis impacts the larger landscapes. Lots of habitat supported, lots of ecosystem functions supported. Now, this is a different map. This isn't a native vegetation map. This is a map of the cultivated areas where humans have converted more than 30% of the landscape for agricultural purposes. Our farmed landscapes are now the largest ecosystem on the planet. So we, every day, are impacting those large landscapes. What are we growing on them? I think a lot of times when I go to the farmer's market, it's easy to start thinking, well, we're eating carrots, we're growing carrots, growing apples, growing fruits and vegetables on those landscapes. But actually, that's not accurate. The fruits and vegetables you see here actually take up a very small portion of our agricultural landscapes. It's the grain crops that supply the majority of our calories. It's no wonder that Science magazine featured bags of cereals on the front of their food security issue, because that's what really feeds humanity. So those crops also take up a similar proportion of our agricultural land. So, of course, as Jennifer mentioned in the beginning, maize, rice, wheat, those are all annual crops. The oilseed crops are pretty much all annuals. 3 crops alone provide 60% of our human food calories. As a species, we rely for 60% of our calories on just 3 crops alone. All annuals. So what's wrong with annuals? Why are they functioning so different, apparently, than our natural plant communities that are dominated by perennials? Well, again, going back to this little mixture of prairie grasses and flowers, here's annual wheat. So it's one of the big 3, and its root system, as you can see, is much smaller, much more shallow. And as an annual crop, once you harvest the seed from it, it dies and doesn't regrow. So that has implications not just in terms of the full extent of its root system, but in terms of the amount of the season in which it's growing. Now, this is what it looks like in the soil. So here's on your left, a wild perennial relative of wheat, and you can see it's still growing down here 7-8 feet into the soil, still tapping into those deep roots, deep resources. The annual wheat, generally our annual crops are tapping into the surface 1 or 2 of soil, so we've restricted our existence really on that surface 2 feet of soil. Now, what does that look like over the season? Well, in Kansas, we plant our wheat in the fall. We call it winter wheat because it grows a little bit in the fall, overwinters, and then grows the rest in the spring. So on the left of each one of these panels, you'll see the annual crop, and on the right, you'll see its perennial relative. So there it is in winter, not much, but the perennial grass still has that deep living root system. Spring, and then of course, right after this was taken, the wheat is harvested, the seeds are mature, and of course once you harvest the annual, it does not regrow, so there's this long period in the summer. So a big portion of Kansas from mid-June through the summer is not covered at all, whereas that perennial still maintains that cover. Just to quickly go through what that implies for a landscape, before you plant the crop, the farmers have to prepare that soil bed, keep it free of any weeds, so you have bare soil. This is what it looks like from a satellite image. So this is, it's called a greenness index. When you see green or yellow, that shows areas where there's living plant cover, intercepting sunlight. I think you can probably guess what the brown is. So that brown area is where we have bare soil across millions of acres in our corn belt. So our corn belt, farmers are keeping this whole area free of weeds by plowing or spraying herbicides in preparation for planting of the corn. And of course, with that, when the spring rains come, you get this tremendous erosion. And that's a big part of our nutrient contamination problems here in the Chesapeake Bay area, but also in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when you plant those seeds, they're very reliant on humans to provide the inputs. So putting fertilizers and so on in there, making sure weeds aren't out competing. And on pretty much all of our agricultural lands, we've degraded that landscape so the conditions into which you're planting are even poorer. And then, of course, you just repeat this cycle over and over. And we have examples around the world. Ethiopia here in the highlands, tremendous erosion, a loss of, here's a field, I'm outlining it with the pointer. About 75% of the productive capacity of that farm field was lost in just 50 to 100 years. They're essentially growing barley on this small area here. Here you have horses. You can see the amount of soil erosion. It's multiple feet. China, the same thing. Losses of hillsides. This is Iowa. This was 2008 spring rain. Tremendous amounts of erosion. So back to the solution. So we have, out of our ecological understanding, we have some solutions in mind. And one set, it's really a set, it's not a single one, but it's a set of solutions that were recommended in this science special issue. Basically, developing perennial solutions to these annual problems. And not just replacing annuals, but also complementing annuals. So some colleagues of mine and I coined a term, perenniation, where we talk about using perennial characteristics directly to produce grains. So plant breeders can and are developing actual perennial versions of the major grain crops. We can use intercropping or rotation systems where actually perennials are grown with annuals. And the presence of the perennials, rather than decreasing the yield of the annuals, can actually increase the yield. And then, of course, the more classic example that people are often familiar with are agroforestry systems, whereby annuals and our annual crops are grown with trees. But the focus here, and this is an important one, is unlike the past where there were systems, nice, sustainable agriculture systems envisioned, but the yields of the annual crops were lower oftentimes. Those staple food crops, the yields in those systems were often lower. We can envision, and we have examples of, systems where actually the yields of the staple food crops are increased. So I want to switch gears here and focus on the real innovative potential of these systems. And they're actually being used by farmers in different places and in different ways. Here's just one example of a farmer in Malawi. And I certainly want to give two people that we have to recognize here. One is Rhoda, who allowed us onto her farm. We had a great time. It was 2 days that we spent there just looking at the full system that she uses to support her family. And then Jim Richardson. Jim Richardson is a photographer. He does a lot of his work for National Geographic. And he did a wonderful issue on soils, which, as a soil scientist, as I was telling some of the students at dinner, you almost can't get a more boring topic to talk with people about. Like that introductory photo showing everybody asleep. Jim, and you should go online and look it up. Jim took a series of photographs where he did soil pit excavations, then showed the farmers above the soil pits. And that was back in that issue called Our Good Earth. It's really worth looking up. Has farm families from different parts of the world standing over their soils. Anyway, Jim and I took a trip to Malawi last April, wanting to document some of these examples of perenniation. And I think this was one of the more elegant. It was a bit more advanced. This farmer had been using it for about 15 years, so she had a lot of the bugs worked out. This is one example. It's not always so easy, but I think it really shows the great potential. Rhoda supports about 7 people on just a couple of acres of land. Back in the early 90s, her husband provided most of the income for the farm. So he worked off farm, sent money back. They would buy shoes, send the kids to school, and so on. Rhoda would grow the maize for food security. I don't think it was a big issue whether they made money on the farming, but it just provided food for the family. Husband was working off farm, bringing money home, but then everything changed. He died, and then suddenly she became responsible not just for the food security, but also for any additional money to send kids to school, to buy soap, to do anything with. So she had a limited amount of land, and it was highly degraded. So she had to figure out ways to greatly increase maize production for food security. But maize isn't really actually worth very much. It's worth a lot for food security, but money-wise, it's not worth much. So she also had to figure out ways to get money to replace the amount that her husband was bringing in. And yet here she was faced with these tremendous problems with soil infertility. So the first thing she did was she started using one of the perenniation systems that we documented in a journal article last year. It's called doubled up legumes. So that's where you're using 2 different types of legumes. Down here on the ground floor is soybean or peanuts, depending on this in this picture is peanuts. The taller shrub is also a legume. It's pigeon pea. Pigeon peas are perennials. So once you harvest them, they can regrow. So, and again, I'll just remind folks that really aren't plant scientists. Legumes are plants that have a unique ability to work with soil bacteria and other organisms to grab that nitrogen out of the atmosphere. They use it to fertilize themselves, but they also provide a lot of fertilizer for the soil for the other crops. And remember, the number 1 crop in this family's household was maize. That's where the calories came from. But these crops are important too because they provide protein. So she's growing legumes to reestablish her soil fertility. She's using a perennial in there to enhance the overall system. And at the same time, she began planting these what are called fertilizer trees. Again, these are types of leguminous trees that, like the pigeon pea and the groundnut, are able to contribute nitrogen to the system. But trees grow slowly. So she used one perenniation system, this doubled up legume system, to provide some food and to build soil fertility while her trees were growing. 15 years later, that's when Jim and I arrived. We actually hired 3 grave diggers to dig a soil pit here. That's what you're looking at. So we went out into her farm field. There she is with her granddaughter, Ratifa. And we dug a soil pit to look at the soil conditions. Here are the tree roots growing down. And right here, you can just barely see it, I think, in this picture. That's a very hard layer of soil that the maize roots typically can't grow through. It's only when these very durable roots from the tree punch through that layer that those maize roots can then go down deeper. Water soaks in, is stored in the soil, and it's a very elegant system in terms of how the ecosystem functions. Water's getting into the soil. The trees are fertilizing the soil with nitrogen. When their leaves fall on the soil, it fertilizes the maize crop. Now, you know, in the past, a lot of the division within the agricultural community was either use organic fertilizers or you use synthetic fertilizers. And, you know, the organics don't want to talk to the synthetics and so on. This lady uses both. She uses the organic sources of nitrogen from her trees, along with some purchased fertilizers that provide extra nitrogen. Neither alone would really do it for her. The trees don't provide enough to get the kinds of yields she really needs, and just putting synthetic fertilizers on really degraded soils is very risky for farmers. They can spend a lot of money and not get the responses in their crop that they really need. So here she's using this system to basically enable her to be able to afford purchased inputs. So 15 years ago, she was getting 3 bags of maize. Those are 50-kilo bags. Now she gets over 40. So now she not only, and it requires about 20 for household food security, roughly. So she's using 20 bags of maize to feed her family. She's able to sell 20. And with the extra maize, which generally isn't worth very much, she was able to start investing in livestock, which is worth a lot. It's expensive to get into, but once you get into it, then you can really generate some income. That's what she's using to put her kids through school. So the increased maize production enabled her to get into another farm enterprise that now enables her to buy other household things and put her children to school. Here we have, this is her other grandchild, Boniface. Here are some of the branches from her fertilizer trees. They lay them out to dry a little bit because it doesn't taste very good to the livestock until some of the nasty tasting compounds have essentially evaporated off. Up here on this tarp, she has maize bran drying. The bran from her corn, she takes the corn into a miller. She gets back this really refined maize flour that they like to eat. But then she's laying out the maize bran to dry to feed to her livestock. And then from her livestock, she gets manure that's concentrated in nutrients, and she applies it back to her farm field, further increasing her maize yields. So do you see how this is like you might call it a virtuous cycle upwards. So she starts out with the fertilizer trees. That allows her to invest in some synthetic fertilizers to boost yields a little bit more. Pretty soon she's able to now afford livestock, which brings her money, provides her even more fertility inputs for her farm. She has a system where she places those corn stalks down into the rows to prevent a lot of weeds. The weeds that do grow, she feeds back to her livestock. You see how we're closing these loops? What she did is she deepened deepened the mine. So she was, with that old system, mining a foot or two of soil. With the tree system and with the perennial pigeon pea system, she deepened the soil mine. She's now mining 2 to 3 meters of soil. She deepened the mine and she closed the loops. She tightened those loops. In the past, she was growing maize, selling it, it was going off farm. Those nutrients were lost forever. She was continually mining her soil to deplete it. Now she's building soil by closing those nutrient loops. That's, I think, the key to these perenniation systems, is to deepen the mine and close those nutrient loops. Agriculture is largely a mining operation. Farmers sometimes put nitrogen and phosphorus back on. In sub-Saharan Africa, they're typically not even putting nitrogen or phosphorus back on. If they are, it's a very small amount. It's a mining operation. Farmers grow the grain, they sell it, goes to the city, nutrients are gone forever, never to be returned. That is really the story of agriculture, which these perenniation systems can help reduce. It might still be a mining operation, but it's much more sustainable over the long term. So I think those offer some real possibilities. The other thing is the idea of multiple benefits. If those trees or the pigeon peas were only providing nitrogen, it wouldn't have been worth the labor and the investment costs. If they were only providing livestock feed, it would not have been worth the investment. They're also providing fuel wood to cook the dinner with. And of course, there you have the full cycle. From the field to the dinner table, multiple nutrients, multiple investments, and multiple benefits. So toward the end of the second or third day, we just started talking to her. In Malawi, the government subsidizes fertilizer currently. So the government will basically make fertilizer available for free to poor farmers such as Rhoda. But that has almost bankrupted the country. It's boosted maize yields, but it's almost bankrupted the country. So the government now is looking for ways to back out of this subsidy system because they cannot, it's unsustainable. So definitely one of the things that the government is looking at is subsidizing fertilizer tree planting, and to get farmers through that initial period when you're not getting benefits from the fertilizer trees, but investing in the future really. So, and Rhoda saw that, she has too much at risk not to hedge her bets. She really is looking at a time when fertilizer prices will go back up because the government isn't subsidizing them, and that she really has to rely on her own system. It's, we talked about rising fuel prices and how that feeds into and impacts fertilizer production. It impacts U.S. farmers a lot. In sub-Saharan Africa, the price of nitrogen fertilizer is 6 to 7 times more than what we pay in the U.S. So if you think it impacts a farmer in Iowa, it hits someone like Rhoda completely. It absolutely prices them out of the market to invest in fertilizer for their crops. Anyway, I will say you can find more on Rhoda. We have a video online on YouTube, of course, and if you just look up those words, it should pop right up, YouTube, USAID, Rhoda. And again, this was a great trip with Jim Richardson. It's one of the great opportunities of being associated with National Geographic. They have such a great way of translating some of these issues and making it accessible to people. So Jim's just been great to work with. But I hope, if nothing else, I've kind of laid out how it really is true that, the flesh and bone that we build, even in the cities, ultimately comes from those big large agricultural landscapes. In the U.S., those landscapes really are in what we call flyover country, the Corn Belt, the grain belt of Nebraska, Kansas, and so on. That's where these large, rather dramatic environmental impacts are really happening. I am, as we talked before dinner, I'm a full supporter of community-supported agriculture. The farmers markets around here are tremendous. And this group of small-scale farmers has grown in recent years, and that's great. I'm very supportive of it. It does almost nothing to address these large landscape issues playing out in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas every year. Water, you know, we're draining aquifers, fossil aquifers in the high plains. Our soils are eroding. We're contaminating our groundwaters. We have some bright spots in the future in ways to address that. And these problems are only larger and in many cases more severe in other parts of the world. So, you know, as a community, as an affluent community, relatively affluent community in the U.S., you know, I hope we do step up and really address these issues because, you know, it's a pretty limited pool of resources that we have to go on. And, you know, in particular, that soil resource is extremely limited. You get out there and you put a shovel in the ground in Niger or Malawi, and you quickly see, wow, we have to get what we need. You know, these people in this region have to get what they need from that little bit of soil unless we deepen the mine and close those loops. Anyway, thanks so much. I hope that was useful.